Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on a very pressing issue, domestic violence in quarantine, an unblinking look at an escalating problem. My name is Victoria Pilati. I am from the Center for the Women of New York. We have been empowering women to achieve full equality since 1987. Today with us, we have expert panelists on the subject of domestic violence. Due to the COVID-19 quarantine, as you can imagine, domestic violence has escalated around the world. Today's expert panelists will report on the increased cases and the available support to survivors in New York City as they shelter in place. At the end of the PowerPoint presentation, we also have New York State resources. Our webinar panelists will address serving and enforcing orders of protection, safety planning, emotional first aid for someone you know who is navigating an unsafe shelter-in-place situation, legal responses, and the needs of particular cultures, South Asian survivors, and Latina, Latino, Latinx survivors. For those of you who haven't seen that term, since Spanish has non-gender neutral endings, the X would be gender neutral. And so the next slide shows the names of our panelists and their focus. We will begin with Sergeant Joseph Alohan from the NYPD. Before we do, I'd like to address how we will answer questions. If you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, use the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom meeting screen to ask a question. If you dialed in, email your question to events, that's EVENTS, at CWNY.org. Your questions will be addressed after the last panelist's presentation. We chose not to interrupt any panelist's presentation. We'd like it to go smoothly and have a great flow. And of course, if you would like this PowerPoint, please direct your email to events@cwn.org. And in the subject line, please write DV webinar PowerPoint. And we will also show this slide at the end of this session if you didn't have time to write that down.
Good morning. My name is Sergeant Joseph Alohan. How's everybody doing today? It's a pleasure to be here with you visually. Unfortunately, we can't be next to each other physically. I just wanted to hope everyone is doing well under these circumstances. I hope and pray everybody is healthy as possible and keeping spirits high. One way we do that is by connecting and hopefully giving a lot of information to hopefully calm a lot of people's fears. So here we are today. So my name is Sergeant Joseph Alohan. I work for the Chief of Department Domestic Violence citywide. We audit precincts. What is it looking like under COVID right now? NYPD is still answering 911 calls. So in case people thought otherwise, we are still answering 911 calls. I also tell people that there probably is going to be a delay to some of the calls due to the fact of the large amount of officers that we have missing in action due to sickness, many due to death, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we are still responding to calls. So calls in regards to violence. Officers are also cautioned when they go to these jobs responding to them due to the fact of COVID, this pandemic going on. They are wearing masks. to make sure that they don't harm the public as well as themselves. But they're also taking caution in regards to the type of calls that they respond to. They take time to register what type of job it is. Typically, we pretty much go to every type of job, but now we're honing into whether is this a call for violence or is this a call related to somebody needing some kind of assistance. Just to give you uptake, you can screen over to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just to give you an uptake, citywide in 2019, our job handled, NYPD handled approximately 278,000 jobs. And that's in regards to the calls that were called into 911. With that, you're talking about 241 radio runs versus 37,000 walk-ins to a precinct. I will tell you that our walk-ins are down dramatically, obviously due to the fact that people are quarantining. We physically go to homes and meet with people. Now, under this new pandemic we find ourselves in, all domestic violence calls are home visits are suspended for the time. What does that mean? We're doing callbacks. We're safety planning with victims via phone. We're collaborating with other organizations and still continuing to do trainings to help people understand what it is that we're still offering. But as it relates to physically going to the home, we're not doing that on the same velocity as we used to. Do we still go out to homes? Yes. And it depends on the type of case that is being investigated. There are some cases that we weigh the options of COVID or violence. And then sometimes there are some cases that scream at us that we need to get out the house and do something. An example of that might be something in regards to where somebody who probably was just released said, I'm gonna come back and kill the kids. You know, something on that extent, officers will be going to do a home visit just to kind of plan through certain things. But that's just one example. We also collaborate with CVAP. There are crime victims advocates in every police precinct. Under COVID, unfortunately, they're working mobile, but nonetheless, we are still collaborating with them in regards to police reports and assisting victims of crime. As it relates to orders of protections within NYPD, the sheriff's office is still business as usual. They're still doing what they did prior to COVID-19. NYPD is still enforcing arrests for violations of order of protection. So again, that goes back to the 911 call. If somebody calls 911 stating that somebody's here violating the order, officers will in fact respond, and when they catch the person, they in fact will make an arrest on it. All temporary orders of protections are extended till the next court date. This was put into place by a judge, but I'm not going to get go too further into that. And family courts can, we tell people that family courts essentially help individuals as it relates to relationships and intimate partner relationships. So we're still advising our officers to where to instruct victims of intimate partners have to go. Again, they're gonna put the bullets up to let you know what our DVOs do, essentially. But I pretty much explained all of that already. I hope if you have any questions, you took note of it, and I look forward to answering your questions at a later time. Thank you.
Ron, stay on the screen just for a minute. Okay, you can go to the next slide. This is Sergeant Alohan's information, but we will be accepting questions in the chat section.
And thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for that valuable information. Our next presenter is Amanda Burden. She is the Program Training and Outreach Supervisor at the Mount Sinai Sexual Assault Violence Intervention Program, also known as SAVI. Take it away, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me, Victoria. And I wanted to also thank Ms. Harounian for hosting this through your Zoom. I understand Zoom has been such an adaptation for all of us. To that point, I want to thank also Sergeant Alohan for being an essential responder. That's such an important role you play. And so many of our friends and family in the community do not have the luxury of being able to shelter in place. And I think that that's worth acknowledging, in specific to the folks who are living with unsafe cohabitors, such as their domestic violence partner. I'm hearing a little echo, so I'm wondering if one of our speakers might be able to mute themselves so that perhaps if we're picking up audio from me into you, that might be reduced. Thank you, that worked.
Thank you.
I also want to thank my colleagues up in the Bronx, Ms. Salinas, so great to see you again, as well as Ms. Raj from Sakhi. So I think that we're all representing a really great kind of cross-functional view of the support that survivors can rely on, even in these difficult times. And I also wanted to say to everybody who's in this webinar, New Yorkers are resilient. Folks, we have survived and we will survive and get through this really intense crisis. I want to remind everybody to take good care of themselves, because amidst all of this, we're living in a pandemic. These are not normal times. We really need to be kind to ourselves, because nobody performs well or optimally in a time of crisis like this, especially if you're trying to help somebody who's navigating another time of crisis. So with that, I will talk a bit about safety planning in this uncertain time. And Victoria, I'm going to try to set my timer, but you are welcome to cut me off if things go over. So the Mount Sinai SAVI program stands for the Sex Assault and Violence Intervention Program. SAVI was established in 1984 specifically to provide survivor-centered resources to those living with or healing from sexual or intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is a specific form of domestic violence that acknowledges the emotional impact of somebody that persons have been involved with previously or currently in a romantic or intimate situation. So if there are folks in our communities specifically residing in Manhattan, Queens, or Brooklyn right now who have the ability to access our free and confidential services, all they need to do is give us a phone call at our main intake line. The number is 212-423-2140. Our website is mssm.edu/savvy. It enumerates all of our services and reminds folks of that main line. And if email is the safest, they can connect with us there. I personally am the one monitoring that email box. In addition to free trauma-informed therapy, our roots are in emergency department advocacy, meaning our volunteers are still actively supporting survivors of intimate partner violence or sexual violence who are going to the emergency departments. I want to touch on a really important fact that Sergeant Alohan already mentioned, which is the lower reporting of this violence. This is for many reasons, but I would say that we probably aren't seeing those lowered numbers of reporting because people aren't committing these harmful acts. It's because people are scared to leave their homes. Not only because of the fact that they might not be able to safely leave their home, but also because of the shelter-in-place orders. Our therapists and the folks in the emergency departments are noticing that people who do reach us are already navigating misinformation because of confusion from our highest levels of administration. I had a survivor who thought that they were at increased risk of being infected by COVID-19 because of the mistrust that their community and they already have of these systems. So it's very, very, very important to remind folks that they do have the right to access the emergency department. They still should reach out to the hotlines that exist, which I know will be shared at the end of this, and to remind survivors that they should listen to their guts on what feels safest. So if anybody has further questions about SAVI services, I will be on for the Q&A. So that's SAVI. And then my role is to remind folks through education and programming that's free that people do not need to be saved or rescued. They need knowledge of their own power and resources and how to access it. You can never change somebody else's behavior. And that goes both for people who are causing harm and also people who are navigating it, especially for intimate partner violence survivors. Constantly they are navigating messaging like from the person who's abusing them that they are not worthy, that they're crazy, that they're the reason that they're experiencing this type of violence. And they're also being told by the communities, why don't you leave? Why aren't you helping yourself? And that is because our societies do not have the ability to process the complexity of relying on somebody perhaps for emotional support, for financial support, for shelter, for food, for health insurance, for documentation, for access to the community, because that is so much of why people stay in a violent relationship. Now we are living in a time where literally we are told, stay in your homes. So that message increases the risk that intimate partner violence survivors are not able to leave and seek safely the resources that they're entitled to. My focus is truly to remind all of us on this call that it can be the difference between 1 week and 1 year and 10 years that a survivor feels the right to seek safety and receive support. So when we talk about emotional first aid, it's really important for us. I started my talk by reminding folks to take care of themselves. It's because you need to be in a calm, thoughtful space where you can listen non-judgmentally when somebody is telling you about the challenges they are experiencing if they are living with violence in their home. It is not helpful to say, why don't you? You should. Why aren't you? This is already going through a survivor's mind. What we can say is, and recognize, is that somebody who chooses or is forced to stay in an unsafe situation is doing that because that is unfortunately the only safe, quote unquote, option available to them in that moment. I'm going to repeat that again. People who choose to stay are using all of the information they have in that moment, including threats of violence, threats that the police will be called and their children will be taken away, threats that they will not have safe home or shelter in a city that already has a lack of shelters for survivors. That might be the best option. The best we can do is reassure somebody that they are not crazy, it's not their fault, and that they do have a right to connect to the services available to them, which includes SAVI, if they are safely able to. Again, my talks usually expand a bit more on connecting to services, but we have to recognize that if you are living in a space where you are potentially the person hurting you is now more present if they are working from home or if they have been laid off, that it might be very unsafe to use the phone, especially if, for example, that phone is on the same family plan as the person who's harming them. A lot of folks have the instinct to tell folks that, you know, just leave, get out. But again, listen carefully for the barriers as to why it's difficult. And perhaps you will hear a resource that you might suggest could be helpful to that person when they're ready to access it. And when we say when they're ready, it means when they feel it is safest for them to access it, when they're emotionally ready to even think about it. So if you are hearing somebody, and again, I recognize the callers on this webinar have multiple relationships with survivors. Perhaps you are a social worker or a clinician or a nurse, or maybe you're the best friend or the parent or the child of somebody who's navigating this type of violence. If you hear escalation of violence, and that's very likely because stressors and social determinants of health explain that when you are not employed, when you are not able to access basic needs, that is a stressor. And unfortunately, violence can be exacerbated by that, because imagine somebody who has to have power and control, that person who is keeping the survivor under their control because of threats to safety. Imagine that abuser's world is out of their control. What are they going to do? They're going to increase actions to feel more in control, which unfortunately, that is controlling the survivor. So if you are hearing that, for example, your friend, your loved one, the person you're supporting is in a home where there are escalating incidents of violence, it's moved from slapping to more intense forms of violence. Or if somebody has been strangled, that means that that partner has tried to kill them, and that's very serious. Or threats have escalated to killing somebody. Or the survivor has said they have the intent and expressed means and a plan to harm themselves. Or you hear that there is a weapon, and that can include domestic items such as knives and other things. That's when you really do need to remind the survivor that 911 is there for that reason. This isn't a moment when you're like, this is going to get extremely fatal. Please validate the survivor that they have a right to preserve their life. Yes, unfortunately, other systems may be activated, and that is a very valid reason why people do not access 911, but it is also, that is a time to call 911. 188 NYC Well is an amazing crisis line. I'm sure that Victoria is going to include that at the end of this. And that is also a really great crisis line where folks can, if they are co-survivors, and this includes you, if you are struggling with the emotional labor of helping somebody through this, this is an extremely scary thing to hear that somebody you care about is in a very dangerous situation. Please don't hesitate to seek those resources. With safety planning, I borrowed this from Safe Horizon. This is an amazing visual. I'm not going to go over this in detail because I want to assume that it's probably very unsafe for anybody who is actually surviving this type of violence is sitting in here with our webinar. But in case you are, and again, Victoria, I will send the one pager, which is formatted in a letter size that's much more digestible. These are some tips and tricks. The one I really want to talk about with COVID-19 is the fact that folks who are stuck trapped, if you will, in a domicile with a violent person, they really need to be safety planning moment to moment. And there are strategies that people can make, such as not being boxed into a room where there is no way to escape, being in a room where there is the presence of a weapon. Those are things that survivors can start thinking about in terms of if and when they are in the same space as that abusive person. Another thing that we have to think about is children. So 10 minutes is way, way too short to talk about safety planning, but again, this one pager can be made available to you, and I will send it after I'm done talking. I think that the most important thing to be aware of also is the fact that there's very little we can do, right? When we are not actually with a person, and even when we are with a person, there's limitations. It really is up to the survivor to know what their needs are to survive moment to moment, week by week. It is short-term planning until the risk of harm is eliminated. But that is a very long-term plan. So when we're talking about safety planning, we're really speaking about moment to moment, especially here in the time of COVID-19. So folks, I did borrow this from wonderful partners in this work. Again, the National Domestic Violence Hotline has incredible resources. I highly recommend folks downloading those. And then I just wanted to also invite folks who feel sexual violence is absolutely a factor in intimate partner violence. I would argue that anybody who doesn't have control over where they go and what they do with their bodies certainly doesn't have full consent and full autonomy. So April happens to be Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And on April 29th, we have Denim Day, which is a national campaign to raise awareness of sexual violence, a continuing impact on our communities, and that we can show solidarity with survivors and remind them it's not their fault and that victim blaming is never okay. So if you would like to join this campaign, just follow Mount Sinai SAVI, my program, on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, And our handle is at Mount Sinai SAVI. I will send this flyer to Victoria to circulate as well. And we also do free trainings on bystander intervention, which is a different form of support that we can show folks if we happen to be in the same virtual or live space where harm is happening. Anyway, Victoria, I apologize. I did take a bit more time, but I really thank everybody for your attention and being here with survivors in spirit. And I wish everybody the best as they navigate the uncertainty of the here and now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, for your well wishes and for your valuable information. And now we move to Jacqueline Harounian from Wisselman, Harounian and Associates, who will speak about family law matters.
Good morning, everyone. Amanda, that was an amazing presentation. There's so much overlap between a lot of the things you talked about and what family law attorneys and matrimonial attorneys are dealing with in terms of advising their clients. I also want to thank Victoria and the Center for Women of New York for having the foresight to put on this presentation because domestic violence is definitely something that is going on. When you take crime off the streets and you go into the home, you have people acting out in ways that are harmful and even criminal, and we are already seeing signs of that. And I thank Sergeant Alohan for bringing those statistics to our attention. In our office, my law firm is in Great Neck. We're right on the border of Nassau and Queens County, and most of us are working from home. We are an essential business, so some of us are coming into the office. And what's been going on is for the past month or so, when the pandemic took hold and they started to shut down the courts, the only thing that was going on in the courthouses were emergency proceedings and hearings. The courts were closed to the public, and believe it or not, up until now, you cannot file a divorce or even file a regular petition for custody in family court on your own or with a lawyer. Those applications are not being heard. We're dealing with emergency matters. And so lawyers and judges were getting day by day and sometimes hour by hour updates on what's happening in the court system. And I want to thank all the wonderful judges, the administrative judges, the bar associations, including the Nassau Women's Bar, headed by Irene Angelakis, who is giving out constant updates on how our clients, how people can have access to justice. So as of yesterday, we got an update, which is kind of an important one. Yesterday, the administrative judges put out memos and directives in coordination with Governor Cuomo that in addition to emergency matters, which include domestic violence matters, which include child protective and child abuse matters, now they are starting to hear priority matters, which are cases that need immediate attention from the court system. And so imagine, our courthouses are full, the family courts where people can go either on their own or with an attorney, the Supreme Courts where matrimonial matters and divorce matters are heard. Up until now, those cases really were ground to a halt. They were not being heard. And now, because of these new directives that came out this week, they are going to start hearing those matters again. And it is going to be by Skype conference. You still cannot enter the courthouses. They are still closed. There are some courtrooms, they're having some virtual courtrooms set up. So now the judges, for the first time, are set up with email, Skype access, and they are conducting conferences with attorneys and with parties. This is a little bit of a silver lining in our court system, because up to now, in New York at least, there was very little virtual courtrooms going on, very little e-filing. Almost everything was done live in person, and people were required to appear every single time at court. And we are now transitioning into a very, very different environment where things are going to be done virtually. There is a lot more, probably much more cost-effective ways for dealing with domestic violence and family court and even divorce court matters. So I anticipate, even though things are very slow right now, as the system starts to ramp up a little bit through the months of April and May and June, we are going to see a very different way of court systems being handled, and that extends to every type of civil and criminal matter. Personal injury matters and malpractice matters and civil litigation and criminal law. You are going to see technology for the very first time really intersect with practice, both civil practice and criminal court practice. So we have almost 100 people listening in right now. A lot of what we've heard so far this morning had to do with victim services and interactions with the police and calling 911 and calling victim services if you really need help in an emergency matter. I want to talk a little bit about maybe a different socioeconomic group, and that's domestic violence matters in family court and matrimonial divorce situations. And I would estimate that we have 9 attorneys in our firm. Probably a third of our practice really did start out with orders of protection, family court, domestic violence type situations that led people into the court system and then calling an attorney regarding a divorce or a family court matter. Right now, we are still getting those calls. The calls have dropped a lot for a lot of the reasons that Amanda said. We have people now stuck at home with their abuser, in a marriage that might be deteriorating, in a relationship where now parents are either working or have lost their jobs. For certain, there's a lot more anxiety and stress in the household. You layer that with homeschooling and a lot of conflict going on. And so for people listening that are really maybe facing abuse for the first time, there might be escalating violence, maybe for the first time in a relationship. Where do they go for help? And I want to encourage everyone listening, or as Amanda mentioned, or as the sergeant mentioned, people that might be related to someone or treating someone or have knowledge of a situation that's escalating, they should be encouraging, to the extent possible, reaching out for help. And it can be reaching out to victim services like the Safe Center on Long Island that I'm affiliated with, the Long Island Crisis Center. I'm on the board of that center, which is getting a lot of calls for suicide prevention and people that are mentally ill and need services, or the other resources and referrals provided during this webinar. They are there. Most of them are completely free, and they are for sure a front line of resources for people that need the help. For anyone that's facing a family situation that's deteriorating, and you want to create an exit strategy, which is what Amanda mentioned, there's steps you can take to gather important documents, to start to reach out to a family law attorney. But I have to caution you, you cannot just pick up your children and leave. There are consequences for that. And if you are in a situation where you own your home, or there's a deteriorating family situation, if you pick up and leave and move out of your home, that's going to have very significant economic consequences. You know, once you move out, you might not be allowed to move back in if you give up your residence. There are responsibilities that people have to pay child support or to support their household if they have income. Everyone is eagerly anticipating these stimulus checks that are going to hopefully start hitting bank accounts. Well, what happens if you don't have access to that bank account? What if you have a situation where one spouse is controlling the other financially, verbally abusing their partner or their children? It's not quite so easy to just pick up and leave. And there are barriers to leaving, as Amanda mentioned. And so it's very, very important that people that are in these situations get advice that's tailored to their situation. You have to make inquiries. Obviously, you have to keep safety in mind too. But most of the family law attorneys that I know, most of them are working from home or in their offices. They are answering calls. And most of these are free consultations. And there's no reason why people can't reach out to attorneys, get information that's accurate, that is going to hopefully put them in a position to keep custody of their children or get the financial entitlements that they deserve in terms of financial support. And so I have a lot more that I can add regarding specific court procedures going on in different counties because this is not a uniform set of directives. If anyone has questions, they can definitely contact me either in the chat or by email because there's a lot going on and it really is specific to each county, although the administrative judges are trying to coordinate efforts with each other. Just as the last minute, at the end, I want to say here for advice to co-parents that have custody agreements or court orders, you have to work together. Hopefully you're not living together, especially if there's issues with conflict in the relationship, but you have to work together. You cannot just disregard court orders and agreements. Children are entitled to see both parents. You should also be flexible with each other. If that means FaceTime, if that means making sure children aren't being sent in and out of households where there could be exposure to germs. Again, these are things that family law attorneys can help give advice on. The number one thing is to stay safe. It's to keep your children healthy and really prioritize the welfare of your children and trying to reduce conflict with the other parent. And that goes double if it was an abusive relationship. So seek out resources so that you can find a way to navigate that as best as possible. I think that's all for me for now. Thank you again to the panelists for an excellent presentation so far. I know we have more to hear from who's coming next.
Thank you, Jackie. And now we have Sakhi for South Asian women. Pooja Raj will be speaking about a very special cultural group. And we at the Center for the Women of New York want to point out that although women are a subset of society with our own special needs, then we have to look to the cultural differences and we have to respect those differences. We can't just rush in and say, why don't you do it this way or that way? The culture and the religion may stop the woman from doing things that perhaps an American-born woman would easily do. So we will have representation from the South Asian culture and then later on from the Latina culture. So now I introduce Pooja Raj from Sakhi for South Asian Women. She is the mental health counselor there. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to everyone who's spoken so far and those who will be speaking for joining us today, and to all of the participants as well. Just a little bit about Sakhi, and Ron, you can start the presentation whenever you're ready. So as Victoria mentioned, my name is Pooja. I'm a mental health counselor at Sakhi for South Asian Women. A little bit about Sakhi. Next slide, Ron. Sakhi actually means woman friend in the South Asian languages. We came about to be in 1989, and it was started by a group of 5 women who came from all different circles of life to really address violence in the South Asian community, because it does exist as it exists in all communities, but a lot of South Asians were not seeking services from the general and the bigger organizations like Safe Horizon and Womankind. Our mission is to end violence against women, and the community that we serve are survivors and their families who trace their origins to South Asian countries, as well as Indo-Caribbean countries. But when we provide services for the Indo-Caribbean countries, we have to be very careful with how we navigate those services, because their trajectory and their immigration to America looks very different than those from the South Asian countries. A little bit about the services at Sakhi. Next slide, Ron. I'm sorry. So it's 2 out of 5 South Asian women will experience physical and or sexual violence in their lifetime. This is a very underreported statistic. A lot of stigma and taboo is associated with violence. Therefore, we do believe that the statistic is much higher. And again, this only takes physical and or sexual violence into account. It does not take emotional, it does not take financial or immigration violence into account. Next slide, Ron. So a little bit about the services, and then I'm going to touch base on how the services have tweaked and changed since our response to COVID-19. These are all of the services that exist at Sakhi, the biggest obviously being domestic violence and sexual assault services. Our sexual assault and domestic violence services include case management, crisis intervention, safety planning, which Amanda touched on earlier, access to legal clinics, weekly support groups, advocacy in courts and welfare agencies. Our economic empowerment program specifically focuses on providing financial stability to survivors. A lot of survivors do, rely on their abusive partners for financial support. Therefore, they might be remaining in the abusive relationship as a result of it. So the financial support and stability allows them to feel empowered and possibly leave the abusive relationship. So the economic empowerment program focuses on access to HRA benefits, job training, additional education, as well as credit card debt. Often financial abuse states that a lot of the abusers will take out credit card debt on their survivor's name. So a lot of survivors will come to us not knowing that there's so much debt associated with their name, and therefore we have to educate a lot around what it means to have credit card debt and how to alleviate that. Mental health services, which is what I focus on, and that's the program that I supervise at Sakhi, really just started at Sakhi in 2019. Mental health is an additional stigma in the South Asian culture. Therefore, it was a very difficult program to start out. My focus really has been to provide individual counseling as well as group counseling to survivors, but to also alleviate the stigma associated with mental health by speaking to the community about psychoeducation and what mental health is and how it's so interconnected with your physical health as well as emotional health. The Youth Empowerment program really focuses on ending the cycle of violence that continues to exist within families and the intergenerational cycles of trauma by really providing services for the youth in the South Asian community and specifically for the children of the survivors we work with. Because a lot of them are secondary survivors, if not primary survivors. And our community and outreach and advocacy program focuses on organizing panels and community discussions. So some of the changes that we're seeing now and the changes that my esteemed colleagues before me touched on is we're experiencing a decrease in calls on our helpline. And it seems like it's a result of the fact that the perpetrators are now back in the homes with a lot of the survivors. And a lot of the children are home now, right? So a lot of the survivors, 80% of our survivors are mother. So at this point, their priority is to focus on their children and keeping them safe, which means they're not necessarily connected with us directly. A lot of our survivors are facing food and housing insecurity. So we have a food justice program to really be able to support them with that right now. What that means is we're actually figuring out ways to deliver services to a lot of the survivors we are connected with. A lot of our survivors are now relying on their extended families for support. And often these extended families are folks who encourage them to remain in the abusive relationship. So there's this constant pressure to allow the perpetrator back in the home. Our economic empowerment department, instead of focusing on jobs, they're now focusing on providing education around unemployment services as well as the stimulus bill. However, a lot of our survivors are immigrants, so they might not have access to a lot of this information. On top of that, some of them are undocumented, which means they do not have access to the stimulus bill, so we have to figure out navigating services for them in other ways. The mental health program is what I focus on, has really been trying to rebuild its foundations during this time. This deck right now has become my best friend. It's the mindfulness cards for myself as well as my colleagues and the constituents I provide services for. A lot of them are not in safe spaces, which means they cannot speak to me for individual sessions. Individual sessions are usually 45 minutes to 60 minutes, right? So they might not have the spaces to actually be on a call with me for 45 minutes. And remember, a lot of these women do not have access to technology, right? So the most of them probably just have access to a phone, and it might not be a safe line, as Amanda was saying. In addition to that, they're taking care of their children, so they're not able to focus and dedicate 45 minutes to me. What I'm doing is I've tweaked services to include briefer check-ins. I'm trying to figure out ways to continue to connect them with each other, because the greatest thing that you can do for a survivor is to connect them with other survivors to decrease isolation as well as to decrease stigma. And I've started to create videos of mindfulness to share with the survivors on a weekly basis. This I'm doing instead of sending out worksheets, because a lot of our survivors do not have access to, again, technology to read those worksheets that I send out. On top of that, they might not be educated. So they might not be able to read the worksheets as they are presented or be able to act on them. So finding these videos is helpful in not just demonstrating and modeling these mindfulness exercises, but again, they're able to see me during this time, which is a friendly face for them. And often service providers, if you've seen, survivors enough times in your offices, you're almost a safe space for them. So that's been really helpful. In addition to this, something that my colleague was saying before me, a lot of perpetrators are using this time to continue to exert abuse. One of the ways in which we've seen is when survivors and the individuals who perpetrated have joint custody or visitation. A lot of the children are not being sent to the survivors we're working with for visitations. So this has created triggers for survivors that we work with. It has created, escalated fears of what's happening with their children. And they're finding it very difficult to navigate the legal process right now. In addition to this, because they're isolated, a lot of survivors are responding to this time as they would have responded to their trauma, because their bodies are reacting to it the same manner. That's why we've shifted our focus into psychoeducation and how you can ground yourselves. I will be available to answer additional questions if you might have, but I want to thank you all for, staying attuned and being just open to all of this information that we're sending your way today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pooja. And next we have Katia Amaya-Salinas from Violence Intervention Program. And I love their website, vipmujeres.org. She is the program coordinator and over Bronx non-residential matters. Thank you, Katia.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you, Victoria, for hosting this great conversation and dialogue around domestic violence in the time of COVID-19. And I want to thank all the presenters that have gone before me. I'm trying to get my slides up. I don't.
Oh, you don't have to. You don't have to. Ron,
oh.
Ron, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. And so, yes, so I just wanted to thank everybody for speaking a little bit about what all our clients are going through at this time. So just a little bit about VIP. It's called the Violence Intervention Program. It was founded in the early 80s. And it was a Latina-led organization. It's still Latina-led by Margarita Wisselman, who's an amazing executive director. And we provide domestic violence, psychoeducational counseling. We provide housing, economic justice to thousands of survivors in the boroughs of New York. I am the Bronx non-residential program manager. I manage our program in the Bronx, but we also have programs in East Harlem. We have programs in and in Jackson Heights as well. So we're cross-borough and we provide the same services there. We, in addition, have an economic justice program that helps survivors to lead more sustainable lives. Obviously, if you're impacted by domestic violence, there's a lot of financial abuse. And so what we try to do is help to find avenues for our survivors to lead lives free of violence. And so we have financial literacy and educational resources in addition to our economic, it's called Economic Justice Program, where we have promotoras who are clients who have experienced domestic violence and have gone through our educational counseling program and are ready to also, after going through their own healing, want to promote our program, which is an amazing thing that they've done. In addition, we have started several other initiatives in our economic justice program. So I want to, there's a lot that already has been said. So I kind of wanted to focus my discussion on the impacts of we serve about 80% of the Latinx communities in the boroughs. But one thing that we've seen as of late during this time is how our clients are unable to reach out for help. And this is something that Mr. Alohan, Chief, I'm sorry, I don't know your title, said because they lack privacy in their home. And so we've been trying to provide ways for them to safety plan. And we have to find ways to be creative. A lot of our clients lack access to critical resources at this time. So what we're trying to do right now is basically triage, kind of like what they're doing in the hospitals. We're triaging because most of our clients are undocumented. The majority of our clients are undocumented. So that leaves us in a really particular position because we have to find creative solutions to address the lack of critical resources that are needed in our communities. And so what that looks like for us is making sure that we are creating ways for our clients to get to and from supermarkets and trying to find the easiest ways for them not to be waiting on food bank lines. So we want to make sure that we're helping them still stay safe and healthy as much as we can. And so also finding partnerships with local supermarkets. I have a partnership in the Bronx with a local supermarket where we set up ways of for them to go shopping. And one of the things that our community lacks is access to food, to healthy food, and also just lack of money and space to keep groceries. So we are trying to find creative ways of having them, do food shopping in a way that'll help them stay safe. In addition, we've also, one of the things that is really troubling is the shared spaces that our clients, is the reality of our clients. So they are living in, some of them live in one room with multiple people. So that makes social distancing really difficult for our clients due to just their circumstance. It is a privilege to socially distance. So what does that look like, and how are we helping our clients to stay safe? And, one of the things that we're coming up with is like policy. Policy is going to be super important here, and getting our voices heard in how are we, I know that the city definitely has come up with some responses for the homeless population, and obviously DV shelters are still open, and we have DV shelters at BIP. We have a crisis shelter, which is still operating. And we have a transitional shelter, which is fully staffed and fully running. But the reality is, yes, there are some measures in place, but there are, we do have clients who are in shelters. But what happens to our clients who are not presently in shelter? They also need additional resources. They need places to quarantine, because a lot of our clients in Queens, as you know, is the epicenter of this virus. A lot of them don't have the ability to then go back to their homes if they are sick, and that they have to. And, that is creating more disease and more illness. And so what are the things that our city is doing to help alleviate some of these, I think, unfortunate deaths? So what are the things that are definitely coming up, and things that we want to start talking about? Obviously housing, and maybe finding creative ways for people to get quarantined. And I know there are things that are coming up, because every day is something new, but this is definitely something that is really, really important. And how do we get our message across to our communities which lack resources, which lack internet? We have some clients whose children still don't have any access to Wi-Fi in their shelters or in their homes. That's part of what our clients see. That's their reality. So we have to be creative. So we have, we're thinking about maybe WhatsApp groups, because a lot of our community is connected to WhatsApp group, because obviously they're connected to their families in Latin America and the Caribbean. So they do use that. So we're thinking about maybe creating like rapid response, because information is changing so quickly. But we want for them to stay connected, because obviously they can't come to us. Obviously we are working remotely from home, and we are providing psychoeducational counseling via remote, through the phone, and also video conferencing. We're finding ways to connect with them. But we want to make sure that there are other creative ways that we're also staying in touch with them, and also for them to provide information to their community, because a lot of the times our clients were coming into our offices, right, for food vouchers, or for diapers, or for just things that that they need on an everyday basis, and now they can't come to us. And so how do we go into their homes and let them know that we are there, and providing them the resources that they need in a really quick way? So that is our response right now. We're really trying to stay connected, and obviously we have a resource list that we are creating at VIP. I can actually probably share that with you guys afterwards. Different resources, federal, state, and also like local community groups that we've been collecting. So that is how our clients are being impacted, and it's real. And but I have faith that because of people like you doing this work, we will get through this. So that is kind of what I wanted to focus on today. There's a real need for for people to know what's happening on the ground. And we are definitely on the ground. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Katia. So I would like to put the screen on, Ron, about the Q&A. So for those of you who have asked for the PowerPoint, you can use, well, before that, take this time if you have any further questions. We do have quite a list of questions. And we're reaching our hour, so if those of you who need to leave the session, we understand, but we will address most of these questions in a few minutes. For those of you who haven't asked your question, you can do so at the chat box or by emailing your question at events, EVENTS, at cwn.org. While we're waiting for a few more questions, I'd like to put on the screen the hotlines that are available, and these will be included in the PowerPoint that you request. So we go down from the national level to the New York State level to the New York City level. The New York City Mayor's Office relies on Safe Horizon to man their hotline, and the number is there. It's on the newyorkcity.gov website. It's also on the Safe Horizon website. Next screen. And so I took the liberty of copying this information from Safe Horizon and also the statewide child abuse and maltreatment hotline is there as well. So do know that because of COVID and because of sheltering in place and the various regulations that change day to day, minute to minute, some of the time offerings of our various nonprofit assistant organizations change. So you do have to refer to their websites as needed. For now, we have that the online chat is available Monday through Friday, 1 to 6 p.m. But again, as workers become ill, maybe that changes, or as needs increase, maybe they bring in more workers. So please stay tuned to the various websites for the latest information of the time availability for these crisis phone calls. But do know that the 800 numbers are there and the chats are there. And there was a question about hearing impaired. It does spell out on the various websites how someone who is deaf or hearing impaired can be assisted. The next slide, please. So the New York City Family Justice Centers in each of the 5 boroughs are a one-stop service right there in the courts. So survivors can get a collaborative assistance when they go to the Family Justice Centers. And of course, the Family Justice Centers do respond to phone calls as well. And they do have an answering service, and calls will be returned the next business day. Next slide. And these are the telephone numbers for each of the 5 borough Family Justice Centers. All of this is on their website. Next slide. So to request this PowerPoint, and it will eventually include Amanda's slides. Amanda has promised to send me some abbreviated slides to include in our PowerPoint, and that would be from Mount Sinai SAVI. So if you could write to events@cwny.org, and please in the subject line, write DV Webinar PowerPoint so we know how to direct our response. And now I'd like, next slide please, Ron. I'd like to speak a little bit about our organization. Of course, domestic violence has always been at the heart of our organization. If we empower women, we have to make sure they are safe. We have to make sure laws reflect that safety net. And so we advocate for women's safety. We also advocate for financial literacy and career development and improving job-related skills. We had to cancel our annual career conference, so stay tuned. We will reschedule it. It is the one event I don't see doing online, but things can change if this pandemic continues. We did cancel our trafficking panel discussion that we may do online. That is also very pertinent to women and all people. And we will partner with Zanta International. The focus is to end child marriage, and believe it or not, the laws in the United States allow for child marriages in most states. And that is a form of trafficking, and that is a form of domestic violence. A child should not be forced into marriage, especially with an older man. So we will partner with our good friends, Zanta International, and their local clubs. We will continue our ESL classes, our legal clinic, our computer classes, and again, we will add financial literacy classes. We had a wonderful women's art exhibition planned that may have to be done online. We do want to promote women in the arts. We did want to promote a performing art exhibition of women as well. And we'll see, we may have to do that by video. Our health fair was also planned, and we have to make a lot of adjustments now, as we all organizations do. But do stay tuned. Next week, we have a legal Zoom conference planned with the focus on legal issues such as healthcare proxy. Does everyone have one? Do you know what will happen if you're so ill? Who will make that decision for you? Wills, landlord-tenant matters. Everything is changing, especially in New York City and throughout the state, on the rights of tenants and the rights of landlords. So stay tuned. That will be next week, April 21st, Wednesday, April 21st at 11. And then we're planning on April 30th, coping with COVID and coping with anxiety in this pandemic. So stay tuned for that as well. And please do check out our website, CWNY.org, and sign up for our email list if you'd like to know these dates. So now let me go to our questions. First question, how can domestic violence victims access protection?
Well, can they elaborate a little bit more? Can they elaborate a little bit more in regards to access protection?
I guess in this time of social isolation, I guess the question is, you would normally visit a police station, so how do they get protection?
Sure. Number one, thank you for the question. To talk about access and protection and you know, police still respond. I always say, when you can game plan before a pandemic, and even during the pandemic, if there's a way to talk to a neighbor, a friend, create code words, create certain innuendos where these people know that you're in distress and are able to make a call or make or text for you, that's always a great thing as well. People always think about calling 911. You also can, in fact, text 911. The dispatcher will, in fact, let officers know that this is a text to call 911 response. So the same goes for the deaf and hard of hearing community, because that was one of the questions as well, as you stated before. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergeant. Our next question, how can advocates refer clients for services? Isn't it difficult with stay in place for survivors to call in without facing more violence? Okay, Amanda.
I was answering stuff in chat in case that was helpful to folks who didn't feel safe to like have it addressed verbally, but that's a really valid point about survivors who cannot safely access resources. We as advocates, and this is not going to directly answer the question immediately, but we have to manage our own expectations on what's possible, right? In the perfect world, well, intimate partner violence wouldn't exist, right? In a slightly better world than the one we're in right now, survivors wouldn't be facing additional barriers because of COVID-19. The reality is, indeed, if somebody is trapped in a home and they cannot access their mobile device, for example, to safely text, then they have to, that's part of their safety plan, as I think Sergeant Alohan had said as well. Victoria, was a question on like, how can people try to help survivors access other resources?
Yes.
I think that you cannot, I can't go into the home of a survivor who is in a dangerous situation, right? And try to remove that barrier. If you are in contact with somebody who's actively trying to figure out how to access stuff, again, letting them know, as Sergeant Alohan had said, that they can text 911, or that, unfortunately, libraries are closed. I used to tell folks, you know, if you aren't safely able to access a computer that doesn't track your history, right, then they could find another device that the violent person doesn't have access to. I was sharing this in the chat because Leslie was asking some really on-point questions. It's like safety planning on, okay, well, when are you not in the view of the person causing the harm, right? So maybe if it's on a grocery trip, or maybe if it's going to the laundromat, perhaps perhaps trying to see if there's, I know that payphones are really hard to find now, but considering maybe if there's a way to make a phone call and delete it from the phone history. As you're hearing, this is also individualized. It's really hard to answer questions like this because every survivor has their own specific needs. Every survivor is creative, thoughtful, and is constantly safety planning. We on the outside can maybe introduce new resources that they might not be aware of, or gently ask them, so if you did that, what do you think would happen next? And being a sounding board. That's the best I can share, and I know my colleagues, Katia and Pooja, are really, really good at this as well, putting the spotlight on them to add to and build upon what I just said. I wish we had concrete answers, but because every person is unique and individual, those hypotheticals have to be very, very specific.
Yeah, I
Go ahead,
agree
Katia.
with you. It's interesting because the more I listen to other providers, there is this website called mysafetyplan.com, all lowercase. You know, you could look into that type of website. I know that people have come up with, as you, I think I was reading your comments, Amanda, of like, you know, words that you could use that help. Let's say like ice cream, or you know, I'm going out to get. If you're calling a friend and you know, you're in need of some help, you can come up like creative phrases, making sure like you have somebody that you're able to call. You know, like Amanda said, it is very individual, and you know, survivors are very creative, and they are survivors for a reason. And so like, I would say, you know, strategize with them what works for them. There are definitely ways that you can strategize from the existing tools that they have. But I would say it's like, you cater it to them, right? Because it is what is going to keep them safe at that moment. But definitely making sure that you're part of that plan, or a friend is part of that plan during these moments, especially now, I think. Pooja.
Thank you both. And just to piggyback on what you both said, we have to take a very person-centered approach during this time, which means focusing on what the individual needs of each survivors are. I think survivors are often seen as very fragile, and that's not the case at all. They're very resilient and they've survived very tough times. Therefore, they will and can survive this time as well. What I want to add, and Katia was mentioning this towards the end as well, is seeing if you could have a middle person intervene. So this can often be a friend or a trusted family member who is of support. It can also be during this time, because a lot of children are at home, sometimes teachers and the schools of the students and the children that they're working with. I know one of my colleagues, an advocate, has utilized like the school's guidance counselor to connect with the survivor they're working with, because the perpetrator is currently in and out of the home. So you really have to get creative with your ways. And sometimes in part of our intake, we also ask, what's a safe time to call you? Because maybe that's a time that a survivor, that a perpetrator isn't at home. And for the survivors that we're working with, Ramadan is approaching as well. So we have to be very mindful of the times when we're calling, because sometimes family is gathering. So really it's up to a service provider and the survivor to come up with a plan that works best for the both of them. And it does not necessarily have to be via phone. It could be a chat. Sakhi now utilizes like a WhatsApp group, right? So if it's not you, maybe they can connect with someone else within that group.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I just wanted to add one more thing. I think sometimes we get so much in tunnel vision, we tend to just focus on the survivor. I've also reached out to many other organizations and always try to enlighten them to reach out to offender organizations, because their initiative in regards to reaching out to people who they know have harmed in the past, and possibly due to this stress that they're going to be dealing with it, and these close confinements, it might in anger them to do more harm. So they take the initiative to start reaching out to offenders. Our DBOs, we take the initiative to reach out to offenders. We have probations, various avenues in order to try to meet someone prior to them doing something.
Great.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jackie.
Jackie, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's just in terms of the perspective of the offender, because of course in my office we represent both sides, and a lot of times it's a question of how do things look to a judge a week or a month or even 6 months later. And several people that have attended today have been asking about evidence and how do you prove things. And of course, that is always a challenge in a legal context. What is convincing proof? And if you can get anything on audio, on video, pictures, evidence, texts, you should be collecting that evidence and keeping a very detailed record. To get an order of protection, you need to specify the date, the time, who was present during the alleged abuse, were there any other witnesses, were there medical injuries, what the conversation was, because sometimes a verbal threat is criminal and actionable and sometimes it's not. You have to have these specifics written down, keep a record. A journal would be nice, but even better is an email record that you can email to someone, your attorney, your advocate, someplace where it's safe and can't be destroyed. The flip side of that is perpetrators, the abusive party, which can be a man or a woman, same-sex relationships or not, they are very good at using technology against the victim. We see this all of the time. And this is how sometimes the abuser gets a leg up in a custody situation. If the victim is really worn down and has been abused, and to the point where she is saying, or he is saying, I can't take this, I'm gonna kill myself, take the kids, I can't handle them. That is something that is very powerful for a abuser to use in court to get a leg up in a custody situation. And there are so many ways that abusive, sociopathic, narcissistic, whatever you want to call the abusive person, they're able to control themselves, gaslight the victim, collect evidence against her. And it is very powerful in court. And what I didn't get a chance to say before, but it's really relevant here, is the new laws in family law, which are really based on joint custody. Domestic violence is always a factor in a custody case. It's always going to be considered relevant, but to a point. You have to show that it impacts parenting. You have to show that the children are affected by it, which means that it's really sometimes, as part of an exit strategy, victims really have to be forward thinking, take the long view, be strategic, and not let their own crisis mode of thinking and acting, because they're so victimized, be used against them. Which is why reaching out to an advocate, the ones that we've heard from today or others, is so important, because it will help the victim gain strength, create boundaries, and think a little bit more long-term about how really to protect themselves and how to protect their children. So I just wanted to make sure that that's said. Technology is for sure a double-edged sword. It's good for collecting evidence, but on both sides. And you should never underestimate the capabilities and the bad faith of an abusive person who's also looking to protect themselves. So wanted to put that out there. Thanks, Victoria.
Thank you. What you're saying, Jackie, reminds me of two cases we had at the Center for the Women of New York quite a few years back. And the women were from two different cultures, but the situation was the same. The woman who was of a Spanish-speaking background said that with the joint custody, her son would come back so violent after visitations with his dad, and he would beat up his mother and his grandmother. And then it was documented that he was so different in school. He was 4 years old. And so again, the schools were involved, and that's how life changed for this family, because the schools would document the changes in behavior. Then we had another woman of Polish background, same story. Her son was 4 years old, and the same thing would happen. He would come home from visitation with his dad and hit on his mother and his older sister. He would just be physically violent. His facial expressions would change. He was just so angry after visitation. So again, the preschool documented those changes, and there was help for that mother and that child.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have to remember that part of domestic violence is also a change in behavior of the children, and that's where the schools and the counselors can help as well.
Yeah.
And that's where documentation can happen, where it can't happen on the part of the woman. She doesn't have the skill set that perpetrator has.
Yeah, I mean, that really goes to the crucial aspect of domestic violence and believing victims and the Me Too movement and everything else. It's the issue of what is subjectively wrong and what is objectively wrong, and credibility issues. And you need evidence, actual third-party evidence, just as you mentioned, mandated reporters, teachers, social workers, neighbors, because there's a tendency in court for the judges, who are wonderful. I mean, I know it's popular to knock the judges in the family court system, but most of the time they do get it right. They're dealing with tremendous volume. In a small fraction of cases, there's just not enough resources to deal with real domestic violence, parental alienation, awful cases. In most cases, though, the judges become somewhat cynical. They believe it's he said and she said. Both sides are lying. Where's the truth lie? And we've had this huge movement in favor of children having access to both parents, because in most households, both parents are working. And this is a problem, because it can be too quick to get to that point and overlooking real issues of harm to the victim and to even to the children, as you mentioned. So it's very important to be mindful of that. Victims and advocates need to collect evidence. It's evidence that wins the day in court. Just a verbal narrative without any backup, it's a problem. It's a problem, and you can defeat it by having some good strategies in place.
We have a very important question here, and it relates to documentation. How do we document whether or not there is an increase in domestic violence during this crisis, given the restrictions of stay at home? So I'd like to answer initially. It was my big question that I had for our panelists in our practice session. So if the abuser is a control freak. That's the major behavior of abusers. They are always in control and they want more and more control. So if they control this technology in the home during shelter at home, my strong theory is that there will be a decrease in hotline and 911 calls because the survivors don't have access to their own technology. So I think the general public needs to be made aware that sheltering at home, and we've seen it in the countries that preceded us, will cause more domestic violence. It's just cause and effect. If you're trapped with an abusive person and they may be losing their job, losing their identity of their job, and spending more time at home, it's just mathematical. There will be more domestic violence. It's just a simple mathematical equation. So I think we've all learned through this group of expert panelists that it is going to happen. There is help, but it is difficult living with domestic violence. So if anyone would like to add.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add very briefly that, and I just added it in the comments, that other countries that have been going through the pandemic for longer than us, including China, including countries in Europe and in Israel, they are reporting a spike in domestic violence reports and also in divorce matters. And though that spike occurred after the shelter-in-place rules were loosened up. So that hasn't happened here yet. This is still a very new situation in the New York area. I think after life goes back to somewhat of a new normal and people get back to work and schools resume or not, that's when we might see increased reporting. Right now, people are very fearful and anxious and uncertain, and they're stuck at home not knowing really what the next day is going to bring, let alone making more forward-thinking plans. And I think 911, calling the police, is really the first action of anyone in an abusive situation. And certainly that's what our attorneys tell clients that report actual physical abuse, a firearm in the home, fear of an imminent danger. No lawyer can help you in that situation that minute. You have to call the police. And that's really, I think, the main message that needs to be out there, that, you know, victims have to protect themselves, protect their children, and that is what the police are there for. And they're the best equipped to deal with it.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I just wanted to piggyback off of what you said as well. We also have to respect the fact that, you know, there are laws in this land, and police officers, our hands are tied. You know, many times our gut is screaming at us one thing, but unfortunately, we can't just bust down somebody's door and say, aha, gotcha. You know, we have to wait till we have a complainant, some kind of probable cause, an EPC, in order to get our boots in there. And as hard as we may say our gut is telling us one thing, if we don't have the facts to back it up legally, we cannot take steps forward. That's why it's important to plan, safety plan, and to Jacqueline's point, I would agree with her. When everything calms down, I think that's when we're going to probably see reports being made of what has transpired many times. So all we can do is, again, plan, collaborate, and prepare for what might happen, and we just hope for the best at the same time.
Just to add to both points of my colleagues, I think Leslie and I were going back and forth in the chat about this as well a little bit. You know, the reports made to the police are not just enough for the statistics, right? Because a lot of the communities that, like, particularly I work with may not feel comfortable enough reaching out to NYPD for many reasons, right? So I think it's also up to community-based organizations like ours, like the ones that are represented on the panel today, as well as those that are in the chat, to do a lot of their work around statistics as well. So one of the things that we're doing is keeping weekly checks of the calls that we're getting and comparing them, right, to time before COVID, but as well as the week prior. So keeping the trends and statistics very much alive and within our organization, and then really voicing this, right, when this time is over, to advocate for increased services for the communities that we serve.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off you, Pooja. I think it's super important to bring voice to a lot of, since we have a lot of undocumented clients, one of the most important things for us to do is provide education around, you know, what happens if you call the police. Some clients never have, and they come to us. And so it's super important for us to make sure that we're providing their rights, right? In addition to, I think prior to this, there's a lot of ICE activities in our community, and that creates fear. And so we're dealing with, I want to say, like, this culture of fear that has been, that it has gone into our communities, and it does take a toll on our communities. And I think this is a time for us to really think about our relationships with systems and how we're approaching communities. And I know that the NYPD has taken steps to, you know, go into communities and to start building these relationships, and that have nothing to do with ICE. But you know, that is a reality that we're living in. And I am hoping, and my hope is that we could take a step back and really examine these relationships that we're building and this reality that we're building, because what was happening before COVID just is, in our community, it was just fear-based, and it continues. But luckily, some of those, you know, since everybody is in place and shelter in place, that hasn't happened, or we haven't heard reports of any ICE going into people's homes. But that was a reality right before, maybe a week or two, in the Bronx where I was working, and that was a culture that was, you know, was rampant. And so I just want to bring light to that, and hopefully, yeah, just that.
Thank you. So that concludes our session. I want to thank all of the presenters and all of the participants for joining us. Please check out our website, CWNY.org, and I hope you'll join us and become a member. And thank you very much to everyone who participated.
Victoria, thank you. All the panelists, thank you. Great job, everyone. Thank you. Be safe, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for
Thank you,
joining.
everybody.
Hope
Thank
to see
you.
you again.
Be well.
Be well.
And again, if you'd like this PowerPoint, email events, EVENTS, at CWNY.org. Thank you.
Thank you.